On a quiet November morning in 2017, in a city where life moved on schedule and courtrooms followed routine, a 7-year-old boy vanished without a sound. No struggle, no witnesses, no goodbye. Abdul Aziz Khan did not disappear from a playground or a dark alley. He vanished from the very systems meant to protect him. What began as a custody dispute quietly transformed into a 7-year mystery that stretched across state lines, databases, and unanswered nights. For his family, time did not heal. It stalled, locked in a single unanswered question. Where is Abdul? Investigators searched, alerts were issued, and then, slowly, the trail went cold. Years passed, seasons changed. Abdul grew older somewhere, unseen, unheard, and hidden in plain sight. And then, in February of 2025, the silence ended. Not with a tip, not with a confession, but with a routine police call that no one believed would rewrite the past. What officers discovered that day would expose how a child can disappear for nearly a decade, and how the most ordinary moments can bring extraordinary cases to an end. Before he became a name on a missing person poster, before his face circulated through national databases and court filings, Abdul Aziz Khan was an ordinary child living an ordinary life. He was 7 years old in 2017, an age defined by routine, by school mornings and bedtime rituals, by small worries that rarely extend beyond homework or scraped knees. Abdul was known by family members as quiet but observant, a child who listened more than he spoke, who preferred familiarity over chaos. Those closest to him would later say there was nothing about his demeanor that suggested he was preparing to disappear, nothing that hinted his childhood was about to fracture into before and after. Abdul lived in Atlanta, a city where millions pass through each day unnoticed, where family disputes unfold behind closed doors, rarely attracting public attention. His parents were separated, navigating the complexities of custody arrangements that, while emotionally charged, are far from uncommon. Court schedules, mediation discussions, and legal filings became part of the background noise of adult life around him. To Abdul, these tensions existed at a distance, felt rather than understood. Children, after all, absorb conflict without always comprehending its cause. Family members later described Abdul as deeply attached to both parents. There were no documented fears, no reports of abuse, no outward signs that suggested imminent danger. That absence of visible threat would later complicate the narrative, blurring the line between domestic disagreement and criminal intent. In cases like this, investigators often emphasize a difficult truth. The most dangerous situations for children do not always arrive wearing obvious warning signs. In the months leading up to November 2017, the family was engaged in active custody proceedings. These hearings are designed to bring structure and clarity, but they can also heighten anxiety when trust has already eroded. Court dates carry consequences. Attendance matters. Decisions ripple outward. On paper, the process is orderly. In practice, it can feel deeply personal, even destabilizing. Abdul, however, remained removed from the legal mechanics shaping his future. His days continued with school, familiar surroundings, and the assumption that tomorrow would resemble today. Those who knew him recall no final farewell, no unusual behavior in the days before he was last seen. There was no dramatic departure, no hurried packing, no sudden break in routine that raised alarms. This detail matters. Many missing child cases are first recognized because something feels wrong. A skipped appointment, an unexplained absence, a silence that arrives too early. In Abdul's case, concern arrived gradually, almost imperceptibly, as normal expectations quietly failed to materialize. When Abdul did not appear where he was supposed to be, confusion preceded fear. Family members initially assumed a misunderstanding, a delay, a miscommunication common in shared custody arrangements. But as hours stretched into days, that uncertainty hardened into dread. Phone calls went unanswered. Court obligations were missed. The ordinary mechanisms that resolve everyday problems offered no explanation. It was at this point that the narrative shifted, from private family matter to something far more serious. Law enforcement would later classify Abdul's disappearance as a parental abduction, a category that carries unique investigative challenges. Unlike stranger abductions, these cases often begin without evidence of violence, without crime scenes, and without witnesses willing or able to speak. The very closeness of the relationship obscures intent. Parent knows how to move unnoticed. They know the child's routines, preferences, fears, and they know how to disappear quietly. For Abdul's extended family, the emotional impact was immediate and profound. The absence was not abstract. His empty room, his unused belongings, the silence where his presence once existed, all became daily reminders that something was terribly wrong. Yet even then, hope remained. Parental abduction cases sometimes resolve quickly. Children are found. Mistakes are corrected. Families are reunited. In those early days, many believed this would be one of those stories. But as weeks passed, hope began to coexist with an unsettling realization. No one knew where Abdul was. Not neighbors, not schools, not extended relatives, and not the systems designed to track movement across state lines. Each unanswered question widened the gap between expectation and reality. Each day without confirmation made the possibility of a prolonged disappearance harder to ignore. What makes Abdul's case particularly haunting is not only that he vanished, but that he did so without disruption. There was no crime scene to tape off, no dramatic last sighting to circulate, no single moment investigators could point to and say, "This is where everything went wrong." Instead, his disappearance unfolded quietly, absorbed into the background of a city accustomed to motion and anonymity. This quietness would define the years to come. As investigators began documenting Abdul's details, his age, his appearance, his family connections, his identity was gradually transformed into data. A case number, a photograph, a file waiting for updates. But behind every entry was a child continuing to grow older somewhere else, his life progressing outside the view of those searching for him. That disconnect between a frozen image and a living child would become one of the most painful aspects of the case. By the end of 2017, what had begun as a custody dispute was no longer framed as a misunderstanding. It was now a confirmed missing child investigation, one that would stretch far beyond the expectations of those first involved. Abdul's name would remain active in law enforcement systems year after year, even as the world around him moved forward. And as investigators would later acknowledge, the most unsettling part was not what they knew, but what they didn't. No sightings, no financial trail that led anywhere meaningful, no confirmed location, just the knowledge that Abdul was alive somewhere, growing up out of reach, his childhood unfolding in secrecy. The question was no longer why did he disappear. It was how long could someone remain hidden, and who would notice when the silence finally broke. In November of 2017, the routine mechanisms meant to manage family separation quietly failed. A scheduled custody hearing, one designed to provide clarity and legal direction, came and went without resolution. One parent did not appear. For the court, it was a procedural absence. For the family, it was the first indication that something was deeply wrong. At the center of that absence was Abdul Aziz Khan, a 7-year-old child who should have been accounted for, returned, and seen. Instead, he was gone. The day Abdul was last confirmed to be with his mother unfolded without urgency or alarm. There were no frantic phone calls placed that morning, no reports of confrontation, no signs of immediate danger. This absence of drama is critical to understanding why the disappearance went undetected at first. Parental abductions rarely announce themselves. They blend into normal transitions, school drop-offs, routine travel, short visits that extend longer than planned. In Abdul's case, the line between expected delay and criminal action was thin, and by the time it was crossed, there were no witnesses left to mark the moment. As hours turned into days, concern escalated quietly. Family members attempted contact. Messages went unanswered. Explanations failed to materialize. The custody hearing that had been missed now carried weight beyond the courtroom. When Abdul did not surface where he was legally required to be, confusion hardened into fear. At that point, law enforcement was notified, and what had once been framed as a domestic matter shifted into an official missing child investigation. Authorities quickly identified the disappearance as a likely parental abduction, with the primary suspect being Abdul's mother, Rabia Khalid. This classification mattered. It shaped the investigation from its earliest moments. Unlike stranger abductions, parental cases often lack a single crime scene, physical evidence, or eyewitness accounts. There is no broken window, no abandoned backpack, no surveillance footage capturing a struggle. Instead, investigators are left reconstructing intent from legal documents, travel records, and silence. Within days, a kidnapping warrant was issued. Abdul's identifying information was entered into national missing person databases. His photograph, still showing a child with a round face and uncertain smile, became the frozen image investigators would rely on for years. Alerts were circulated. Agencies were notified. But the early momentum investigators rely on in missing child cases was already slipping away. There were no confirmed sightings, no credible tips, no financial transactions that clearly indicated a destination. Every possible lead branched outward and then collapsed under scrutiny. Airline records showed nothing definitive. Border crossings yielded no confirmation. Schools did not register Abdul's enrollment elsewhere. The absence was total. For the family left behind, the emotional impact intensified with each passing day. There is a unique agony in parental abduction cases, a pain compounded by ambiguity. Loved ones know the child may still be alive, still waking up each morning, still growing. That knowledge sustains hope but also prolongs suffering. There is no closure, no certainty, only the relentless passage of time. Law enforcement continued working within the constraints of the case. Officers conducted interviews, verified known associates, and attempted to track any aliases that might have been used. Yet, without cooperation from the abducting parent, every investigative step became more complex. False identities, informal living arrangements, and deliberate isolation can render even robust systems ineffective. This was not a disappearance driven by chaos. It was one shaped by planning. As weeks stretched into months, the investigation transitioned from immediate response to long-term monitoring. Abdul's name remained active. His file was reviewed periodically. Each update was logged, even when there was nothing new to report. For investigators, this phase is among the most difficult. The urgency of the first days fades, replaced by a slow vigilance that demands patience without reward. Public awareness efforts were considered, but parental abduction cases occupy an uncomfortable space in media coverage. They lack the dramatic elements that draw sustained attention, yet their emotional stakes are immense. Without new information to share, Abdul's story struggled to remain visible beyond those who were directly invested in finding him. By the end of 2018, the disappearance had settled into a grim pattern. No sightings, no communication, no evidence that narrowed the search. Each passing birthday marked another year Abdul was missing, another year his image no longer matched the child he had become. Investigators updated age progression models, knowing they were approximations at best. The longer a child remains missing, the harder recognition becomes. Time worked against everyone searching for Abdul. Witness memories faded. Records grew cold. Leads aged out of relevance. Yet the case was never closed. It lingered in the background of law enforcement systems, flagged, waiting for a moment when chance or circumstance might intervene. For Abdul himself, though unseen, life continued somewhere else. He grew older. He learned new routines. He adapted to a reality disconnected from the one he left behind. That silent growth, occurring beyond the reach of those who loved him, became the most haunting element of the case. A child missing is not frozen in time, no matter how static their photograph appears. As investigators would later reflect, the most unsettling realization was not that Abdul had vanished, but that he had done so successfully. For years, no system designed to detect such disappearances had located him. No traffic stop, no school registration, no medical record had surfaced to trigger recognition. It was as if he had slipped between the seams of modern record-keeping. By the early 2020s, Abdul's disappearance was functionally a cold case. Active searches gave way to periodic reviews. Hope remained, but it was tempered by realism. Many parental abduction cases are resolved eventually, but not all end with reunions. Some children are never found. Others reappear only after decades, if at all. And yet, the file stayed open. What no one could predict was that the silence surrounding Abdul's disappearance would not be broken by a confession, a tip, or a technological breakthrough, but by a call so routine that it barely registered as significant. A call that would arrive years later in a different state under circumstances no one could have anticipated. For years, Abdul Aziz Khan's case existed in a state of suspension, active but silent. His name remained logged in law enforcement systems, his photograph preserved in databases that quietly aged alongside him. Then, on February 23, 2025, the silence ended in a way no investigator could have planned. Not with a breakthrough tip, not with a confession, but with a routine call reporting suspicious activity at a vacant home in Highlands Ranch. A homeowner, monitoring a property listed for sale, noticed individuals entering through a rear door without authorization and contacted local authorities. To responding deputies, it appeared to be an ordinary burglary in progress, one of countless calls handled each year, rarely linked to long-term investigations. When deputies arrived at the scene, they did not immediately enter the home. Instead, they observed a vehicle parked in the driveway. Inside were 2 adults and 2 children. The adults appeared calm, not hurried or evasive, and initially offered no explanation that raised immediate alarm. This moment, seemingly mundane, would later be recognized as the pivot point in a case that had stretched across 7 years and multiple jurisdictions. As deputies began standard identification procedures, the encounter shifted. The adult woman in the vehicle was unable to produce valid identification. Her responses were vague, inconsistent, and failed to satisfy routine verification. This too was not unusual. Officers encounter individuals without identification frequently, but protocol requires follow-up. Fingerprints were taken and submitted through law enforcement databases, a process that typically confirms identity within minutes. The result was immediate and unmistakable. The fingerprints matched Rabia Khalid, a woman with an active kidnapping warrant dating back to 2017. Deputies now understood that this was no longer a burglary call. It was something far larger. Backup was requested. Procedures shifted. The scene was secured. Attention then turned to the children in the vehicle. One of them was a teenage boy whose appearance did not immediately align with the 7-year-old child whose photograph remained frozen in missing person files. This discrepancy highlights one of the most difficult realities in long-term missing child cases. Time alters recognition. Children grow. Faces change. Voices deepen. But identifiers, birth records, fingerprints, familial connections remain. Through careful verification, deputies confirmed what databases alone could not visually reveal. The boy was Abdul Aziz Khan. 7 years after his disappearance, Abdul had been found alive. The confirmation process was handled with precision and restraint. Child welfare authorities were contacted immediately. Abdul was separated from the adults and placed into protective custody, shielded from media exposure and public identification. Law enforcement officials have since emphasized that safeguarding the child's emotional and psychological well-being took priority over public disclosure. Details about his condition were intentionally limited, reflecting protocols designed to protect recovered minors from additional harm. The second adult in the vehicle was identified as Elliot Blake Bourgeois, the husband of Rabia Khalid and not Abdul's biological father. He was also taken into custody. Both adults were detained without incident. What followed was a rapid shift from discovery to documentation. Investigators began reconstructing 7 years of absence, where Abdul had lived, how he had been concealed, and which systems had failed to detect his presence. This phase of investigation differs fundamentally from initial searches. It is retrospective, methodical, and constrained by the need to protect a child who has just re-entered a world he may barely remember. Authorities confirmed that Abdul had been living under conditions designed to avoid detection. While specific details remain sealed due to ongoing legal proceedings and privacy laws, investigators acknowledged the use of false identification and deliberate isolation. These measures explain why no school enrollment, medical records, or routine encounters had triggered recognition over such an extended period. Law enforcement officials later credited the outcome not to advanced technology or years of targeted searching, but to adherence to basic procedure. A fingerprint check, a routine response, an observant deputy following protocol. In cases like this, the difference between resolution and continued disappearance often hinges on moments that seem insignificant at the time. From an investigative standpoint, the discovery raised immediate questions. How many times had Abdul passed unnoticed through public spaces? How many opportunities for detection had been missed? And how could a child remain hidden for nearly a decade in an era defined by surveillance, records, and digital footprints? These questions would form the foundation of the legal proceedings to follow. For the family that had waited years for answers, the news arrived with conflicting emotions: relief, disbelief, and the weight of time lost. Abdul was alive, but the years that had passed could not be returned. Reunification, when and if it occurred, would be a process, not a moment. Investigators also faced the reality that the case, while solved in terms of location, was only beginning in terms of accountability. Charges were prepared. Evidence was cataloged. Jurisdictional coordination between Georgia and Colorado was initiated. What had started as a missing child investigation was now a criminal case involving kidnapping, identity fraud, and long-term concealment. Perhaps most unsettling was the simplicity of how it ended. 7 years of silence, broken not by a dramatic confession or a breakthrough lead, but by a call reporting a suspected burglary at a vacant house. A reminder that in true crime, resolution often arrives not with spectacle, but with coincidence. And as Abdul was taken away from the scene, alive, older, and protected from view, investigators were left confronting a sobering truth. The systems designed to find missing children are only as effective as the moments when they intersect with ordinary police work. The question now was no longer where is Abdul? It was what happens next, for him, for those responsible, and for a case that had quietly tested the limits of modern investigation. Long before the burglary call in Colorado, the case of Abdul Aziz Khan had entered a phase investigators quietly refer to as limbo. It was not inactive. It was not closed. But it no longer moved with urgency. Files were maintained, alerts remained live, and periodic reviews continued. But without new information, progress slowed to a crawl. This is the uncomfortable middle ground of missing child cases, where hope persists but direction fades, and every year that passes increases the emotional cost for those waiting. By early 2018, law enforcement had already exhausted the most immediate avenues. Known associates were interviewed. Travel possibilities were explored. Financial activity was reviewed where possible. Yet parental abduction cases, especially those involving deliberate concealment, resist conventional investigative pressure. The person hiding the child knows exactly what to avoid: schools that require documentation, medical systems that create records, stable housing that leaves a trail. Instead, movement becomes informal, identity becomes fluid, and isolation becomes a strategy. Investigators understood early on that Abdul was likely being raised under an assumed identity. This realization fundamentally altered expectations. Each passing year reduced the likelihood that he would be recognized by appearance alone. Age progression images were created and circulated, but these tools are approximations. They depend on averages, genetics, and assumptions that rarely align perfectly with reality. A 7-year-old boy does not simply become an older version of the same face. Childhood reshapes features, posture, voice, and presence. Abdul was growing into someone new, someone even his own photograph could no longer accurately represent. For Abdul's family, time became both an enemy and a measure of endurance. Birthdays passed without celebration. Holidays arrived carrying absence instead of routine. Each year forced a recalibration of hope: how to believe without expectation, how to wait without surrender. Families of missing children often describe living in a suspended state, unable to grieve fully because there is no confirmation of loss, yet unable to move forward because the past remains unresolved. In parental abduction cases, This suspension is intensified by the knowledge that the child is likely alive, somewhere growing up beyond reach. Investigators, too, faced psychological strain. Unlike homicide cases where evidence anchors inquiry, missing child cases offer few fixed points. There is no final scene, no definitive timeline, no physical closure. The work becomes archival, maintaining accuracy, preserving relevance, and ensuring that if a moment ever arrives when the case intersects with new information, nothing has been lost to time. Detectives rotated. Supervisors changed. Yet the file remained, its presence a quiet reminder of unfinished work. Throughout the late 2010s and early 2020s, Abdul's name remained active in national systems. His information was cross-referenced against encounters, databases, and periodic sweeps designed to locate long-term missing children. These systems are powerful, but they are not omniscient. They rely on interaction. A traffic stop, a school enrollment, a medical visit. Without contact, even the most comprehensive databases remain silent. This silence prompted difficult internal questions. How does a child remain invisible for years in a society defined by records? How many systems must be avoided for that invisibility to persist? Investigators later acknowledged that the answer lies not in one failure, but in a series of deliberate choices designed to minimize exposure. Avoiding institutions, avoiding permanence, avoiding scrutiny. Over time, these choices create a parallel existence, one that can persist undetected unless disrupted by chance. As years passed, the case periodically resurfaced in discussions about missing children, particularly those involving parental abduction. These cases challenge public perception. They lack the clear villainy of stranger abductions, yet the harm inflicted is no less severe. A child removed from their legal guardianship, their community, and their identity experiences a form of loss that extends beyond physical absence. Investigators and child welfare experts consistently emphasize that such removals disrupt development, attachment, and trust, even when basic needs appear to be met. By 2020, the world itself had changed. Global events shifted priorities, strained institutions, and altered daily life. For families of missing children, these changes compounded isolation. Traditional avenues for awareness narrowed. Resources were redirected. Yet Abdul's case persisted quietly, a reminder that unresolved tragedies do not pause for broader crises. Internally, law enforcement agencies maintained Abdul's case through routine audits. These reviews are not dramatic. They involve confirming data accuracy, updating photographs, verifying that warrants remain active, and ensuring that if new information ever surfaces, the response will be immediate. It is a form of vigilance that rarely produces visible results, but without it, cases disappear entirely. Investigators later reflected on the difficulty of sustaining attention over such a long period. Human focus is finite. New cases arrive daily. Emergencies demand immediate response. In this environment, unresolved cases risk becoming background noise. Preventing that requires discipline and institutional memory, systems designed not just to respond but to remember. For Abdul, unknown to those searching, life continued elsewhere. He aged into adolescence. He developed routines, relationships, and a sense of normalcy shaped by circumstances outside his control. What he was told, what he believed, and what he understood about his past remain protected details. Authorities have intentionally withheld this information, recognizing that public curiosity does not outweigh a child's right to privacy and recovery. The longer Abdul remained missing, the more the case tested assumptions about detection. Modern society often assumes that technology makes disappearance impossible. Cameras watch streets, records track movement, databases connect agencies. And yet, Abdul's case demonstrated a sobering reality. Technology cannot identify what it never sees. Without interaction, there is nothing to capture. As the years stretched on, hope became quieter but more resilient. Family members continued to believe in the possibility of recovery, not because evidence supported it, but because surrender felt impossible. Investigators shared this belief cautiously. They had seen cases resolved after decades, often through chance encounters rather than sustained pursuit. The lesson was clear. Persistence matters, even when progress does not. By early 2025, Abdul's disappearance had lasted more than 7 years. Statistically, cases of this length face diminishing odds of resolution. Yet the warrant remained active. The file remained accessible. And somewhere, unknown to everyone searching, a set of circumstances was aligning toward an ordinary moment that would disrupt an extraordinary concealment. What no one could have known during those long years was that the case would not be reopened by analysis or technology, but by routine. A neighbor noticing something out of place. A call placed without expectation. Deputies responding without foreknowledge of the history about to surface. In retrospect, investigators would describe the years in limbo not as failure, but as waiting for the moment when Abdul's hidden life intersected, however briefly, with the systems that had been searching for him all along. That moment was closer than anyone realized. The resolution of Abdul Aziz Khan's disappearance did not arrive with warning. There were no renewed tips, no breakthroughs in forensic technology, no sudden confessions. Instead, it emerged from a sequence of procedural steps carried out by deputies who had no prior connection to the case they were about to close. On February 23, 2025, what began as a report of trespassing at a vacant property escalated quietly, guided not by instinct or suspicion, but by protocol. The deputies who responded did not know they were standing at the end of a 7-year search. They only knew that something about the situation did not align with what they had been told. Once the fingerprint results confirmed the identity of Rabia Khalid, the investigative posture shifted immediately. A woman long wanted for second-degree kidnapping was now in custody, standing in front of officers who had encountered her by chance. The implications were immediate and serious. Officers secured the scene, separated the adults from the children, and initiated a coordinated response involving detectives, child protection services, and interstate authorities. What followed was not chaos, but control, an effort to ensure that the discovery of Abdul did not introduce further trauma. The presence of Elliot Blake Bourgeois added complexity to the case. Identified as Khalid's husband and not Abdul's biological father, Bourgeois had been living alongside the child under circumstances that were still being assessed. Investigators moved carefully, aware that assumptions made too quickly could jeopardize both the child's welfare and the integrity of the case. Both adults were detained without resistance. Neither attempted to flee. Neither offered immediate explanation beyond what had already been contradicted by evidence. As Abdul was removed from the scene, investigators faced a delicate balance. Public interest in missing child cases is intense, particularly when a child is found alive after many years. But authorities limited disclosure, emphasizing that Abdul's privacy was paramount. He was not presented to the media. His name was confirmed only after protective measures were in place. Officials would later explain that recovery is not the end of a missing child case. It is the beginning of another process entirely, one focused on stabilization, evaluation, and long-term care. Behind the scenes, detectives began reconstructing the 7 years Abdul had spent hidden. This phase of investigation differs sharply from the search phase. Instead of asking where is the child, investigators now asked how was the child concealed? What documents were used? What identities were assumed? Which systems were avoided and how consistently? Each answer carried implications not just for accountability, but for understanding how similar cases might be prevented in the future. Charges were prepared methodically. Rabia Khalid faced counts including second-degree kidnapping, forgery, identity theft, providing false information, and trespassing. These charges reflected not a single act, but a pattern of sustained deception. Prosecutors emphasized that parental status does not negate criminal responsibility when a child is removed in violation of court orders and concealed for years. The law draws a clear line between custody disputes and kidnapping, and in this case that line had been crossed decisively. Elliot Blake Bourgeois was also charged, accused of participating in the concealment and identity fraud that allowed Abdul to remain undetected. His role, while distinct from Khalid's, was treated as integral to the continuation of the offense. Prosecutors later noted that long-term concealment rarely occurs in isolation. It requires cooperation, silence, and shared intent. Law enforcement officials were careful in their public statements. They avoided language that framed the discovery as miraculous or heroic. Instead, they highlighted the importance of routine policing. One official noted that this case was resolved because deputies followed procedure. That emphasis was deliberate. It underscored a central truth of the investigation. Systems work when they are used consistently, even when the outcome seems improbable. For Abdul's family, the arrests brought relief mixed with grief. The child they had searched for was alive, but he was no longer the 7-year-old they remembered. Time had intervened. Reunification, if it occurred, would require patience, professional support, and acknowledgement of what had been lost, as well as what had been found. Authorities have consistently refrained from describing those processes publicly, recognizing that recovery unfolds away from cameras and headlines. From a legal standpoint, the case moved quickly once arrests were made. Jurisdictional coordination between Colorado and Georgia ensured that charges reflected the full scope of the offense. Extradition considerations were addressed. Court appearances were scheduled. Evidence, digital, documentary, and testimonial, was cataloged with care. Unlike investigations driven by urgency, this phase demanded precision. Every detail mattered. Every misstep carried consequences. Investigators also began internal reviews. How had Abdul remained undetected for so long? What safeguards had worked, and which had not? While no single failure was identified, the case prompted renewed discussion about parental abduction, record sharing, and the limitations of existing systems. These discussions were not accusatory. They were analytical, aimed at strengthening response rather than assigning blame. Public reaction was swift but measured. Headlines focused on the child's recovery rather than the crime itself. Many expressed disbelief that a child could remain hidden for 7 years in modern America. Others pointed to the case as evidence that missing child files should never be closed, no matter how much time has passed. Law enforcement echoed that sentiment. Persistence, they emphasized, is not dramatic, but it is essential. As Khalid and Bourgeois entered the criminal justice system, the narrative of the case shifted again. What had once been a story of absence became a story of consequence. Accountability was no longer abstract. It was procedural, deliberate, and unfolding in real time. Yet even as the legal process advanced, investigators remained aware that the most important outcome had already occurred. Abdul was no longer missing. He was alive. He was protected. And for the first time in 7 years, his future would be shaped not by concealment, but by care. The final question was no longer how was he found? It was how would justice and healing be defined in the aftermath of his return. When the case entered the courtroom, it shed the ambiguity that had defined it for years. Silence gave way to structure. Absence gave way to evidence. The disappearance that once lived only in files and unanswered questions was now framed by charges, statutes, and sworn testimony. Prosecutors outlined a narrative not of momentary panic or misunderstanding, but of sustained intent, arguing that the child's disappearance was not an impulsive act, but a deliberate, long-term removal carried out in defiance of lawful custody orders. The courtroom, measured and methodical, became the place where 7 years of concealment were finally examined in sequence. The prosecution began by establishing the legal foundation: a valid custody order, a scheduled hearing, and a failure to appear. These facts were not contested. Instead, they served as the point from which all subsequent actions flowed. From there, prosecutors detailed the steps taken after the disappearance: missed obligations, lack of contact, and the issuance of a kidnapping warrant. Each element was introduced carefully, emphasizing chronology over emotion. This was not a case built on spectacle. It was built on continuity. Key evidence focused on identity fraud and concealment. Records demonstrated the use of false information, the avoidance of institutions that require documentation, and a pattern of movement designed to minimize traceability. Witnesses described how long-term concealment requires consistency, maintaining the same false identity, avoiding attention, and ensuring that no interaction triggers verification. Prosecutors argued that these actions, repeated over years, demonstrated intent beyond reasonable doubt. The role of the second defendant was addressed separately but firmly. The state contended that prolonged concealment is rarely possible without cooperation. Evidence presented suggested awareness, participation, and support in maintaining the conditions that kept the child hidden. The argument was not that responsibility was equal, but that it was shared. Silence, prosecutors noted, can be an act. Defense arguments centered on intent and motivation. Counsel acknowledged the facts of removal but challenged the characterization of kidnapping, framing the actions as driven by fear rather than malice. They emphasized parental bonds, emotional strain, and the absence of physical harm. However, the court was clear on a critical distinction. Motive does not negate legality. Love, fear, or belief in personal justification does not supersede court orders or the child's right to lawful care. Throughout the proceedings, the child remained absent from the courtroom. This absence was intentional. The court recognized that participation could compound trauma, and protective measures were implemented to shield the child from unnecessary exposure. Statements referencing the child's condition were limited, respectful, and carefully controlled. The focus remained on adult actions and accountability, not on eliciting sympathy through personal detail. Expert testimony provided context rather than drama. Specialists explained the impact of long-term concealment on child development, attachment, and identity. They spoke clinically, avoiding speculation about specific outcomes, but emphasizing that disruption, even in the absence of overt abuse, carries lasting effects. These statements reframed the harm at issue. Not visible injury, but lost continuity, fractured trust, and stolen time. As the trial progressed, the jury was presented with a case defined by accumulation. No single action viewed in isolation told the full story, but together, missed hearings, false identities, years of silence, and eventual discovery during an unrelated police call. They formed a pattern that was difficult to dismiss. The prosecution returned repeatedly to one theme: duration. This was not a brief lapse corrected by remorse. It was 7 years of sustained concealment. Closing arguments reflected that focus. Prosecutors emphasized that justice in this case was not about punishment alone, but about affirming boundaries between custody and control, between parental rights and legal responsibility. Defense counsel urged consideration of context and intention, asking jurors to weigh emotional complexity against statutory definitions. The jury deliberated with those tensions in mind. When the verdict was delivered, it was measured and definitive. The court found that the evidence supported the charges as presented. Accountability was affirmed. Sentencing reflected the seriousness of prolonged concealment and identity fraud, balanced against factors considered by the court. Specific terms were outlined without spectacle. There were no outbursts, no dramatic declarations, just the formal conclusion of a legal process that had taken years to reach this point. For the family, the verdict did not erase what had been lost. Courts do not return time. They do not restore missed birthdays or years of uncertainty. What they offer instead is recognition that a wrong occurred, that it was acknowledged publicly, and that it carried consequences. In that sense, the trial marked an end not to pain, but to ambiguity. The court also addressed the future. Custody determinations and care arrangements were handled separately, guided by child welfare authorities rather than criminal sentencing. The emphasis was forward-looking: stability, safety, and support. The legal system, having resolved responsibility, stepped back to allow recovery to proceed beyond its walls. As proceedings concluded, the case moved from public record into history. It would be cited in discussions about parental abduction, about the limits of detection, and about the power of routine procedure to resolve extraordinary cases. But for those most affected, its significance was personal rather than symbolic. Justice in this context was not loud. It was deliberate, and it arrived finally after years of waiting. When Abdul Aziz Khan was finally found, the story did not end. It changed form. Recovery is not a moment of closure. It is a process of reorientation. For Abdul, now a teenager, the world he re-entered was not the one he had left behind. Time had moved forward without him. People had aged. Places had changed. And the systems that had once searched for him now stepped back, allowing child welfare professionals to guide the next phase quietly, away from public scrutiny. Authorities released few details, and that restraint was intentional. A child's recovery does not belong to headlines. It belongs to care, patience, and privacy. For Abdul's family, relief arrived intertwined with grief. The certainty they had longed for came with the realization that 7 years could not be undone. What was lost could not be restored, but what remained could still be protected. Family members expressed gratitude to law enforcement while acknowledging the long road ahead. Reconnection, when possible, would require time, trust, and professional support. Healing, they understood, is not immediate. It unfolds slowly, in ways rarely visible to the public. Within law enforcement, the case prompted reflection rather than celebration. Officials emphasized that no single hero resolved the disappearance. There was no dramatic tip, no last-minute confession. The case was closed because ordinary procedures were followed correctly, because a fingerprint was checked, a protocol observed, a moment of routine attention applied without assumption. That lesson resonated. In a field often defined by urgency and crisis, this outcome reaffirmed the value of consistency. The case also reshaped conversations around parental abduction. It underscored how easily such cases can fade from view, and how difficult they are to detect once concealment becomes a way of life. Experts noted that disappearance does not require isolation from society, only isolation from systems. Avoiding records, institutions, and permanence can create invisibility even in a data-driven world. Abdul's case became a reference point for that reality. Importantly, it also reinforced why missing child cases must never be closed simply because time has passed. Persistence matters. Files maintained, warrants renewed, names remembered. Many long-term recoveries occur not because of sustained pursuit, but because readiness meets coincidence. When those moments arrive, preparation determines outcome. For the broader community, the story challenged assumptions about safety and oversight. It reminded the public that disappearance does not always look dramatic, and that vigilance does not always mean suspicion. Sometimes it means noticing what does not belong. Car in the wrong driveway. A door opened where it should not be. Small observations can intersect with larger truths. Today, Abdul's life continues beyond the frame of this story. The details of that life are rightfully protected. What matters is not where he was hidden, but that he is no longer hidden at all. His future, once shaped by secrecy, now rests in the open, guided by support rather than concealment. This case leaves behind no spectacle, no triumphant ending. Instead, it leaves a quieter legacy. That patience can coexist with hope, that routine can yield resolution, and that even after years of silence, disappearance does not have to be permanent. If this investigation has stayed with you, consider the stories still waiting for attention, the names that remain unresolved, the families still suspended between hope and uncertainty. And if you value calm, evidence-based storytelling that centers dignity over drama, subscribe, stay engaged, and help ensure that silence is never mistaken for forgetting.